So this is the third video in the series on how to use Automate in Probe for EPMA, and here we're going to show you how to actually select samples and run them. So here we can, choose standards, we can choose unknowns, or in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select all samples because say I'm going to run a run overnight and I want to run all my standards, and then once that's done, I want it to go on and run the unknowns. So I'm going to hit all samples. And then a cool feature here is if you hit select standards, it will automatically select all of the standards that you've added to your run in your sample setup. If you're not sure how to do a sample setup, there are videos on this channel that show you that as well. So by hitting this, it automatically selects all the standards that you have selected to go with this routine in your sample setup. So then, since we have it on all samples, we've selected the standards. You do need to do this first because if you select the unknowns first, it'll deselect them when you hit select standard. But we've selected all of the standards with our select standards. And then we're going to scroll down to the bottom of the list and we're going to see our unknowns, and if there were wave scans, you could add those as well. And then we can hold down control and we can select our unknowns as well. So now we have our unknowns and all of our standards selected. Then we want to acquire those. So we're going to make sure that acquire standard samples and acquire unknown samples is checked. Those are your automation actions, what it's actually going to do. You can have it use autofocus if you want. And these other sort of self-explanatory options you can check if you want them. The only other thing you need to remember to fix is how many standards you actually want to run. So this is the number of repeats that it's going to do for each standard. So if I put 5 in there, it's going to run each of these standards 5 times. Something to note about this, if you have, say you tell it to run 15 standards, but you only have one digitized, it's going to go to that position, run it once, and then it's going to use this standard increment and it's going to move 20 microns in the X direction and run it again up to your total of 15 times you want to run it, or 5, or however many. There is an option that's kind of a handy feature. If we go to acquire, that you can get to from here, you hit acquire, this window comes up, we go to our acquisition options. We can tell it only use digitized standard positions. So when that box is checked, like I have it here, it will not increment. It will only run if it's got a digitized position. So for instance, in this case, our calcium fluoride standard here, I've told it to run 5, but I only have 1 selected. It's only going to run that one. It will not automatically increment when this option is selected. If you want it to automatically increment, you uncheck that. And now, even though I only have 1 digitized position, I've told it to do 5, so it's going to do 5. So that's kind of a handy feature. It's a way that you can do different numbers of standards in a run instead of doing all your standards 5 times. Say you want to do all of your calibration standards 10 times, but you only want to run your precious small check standards 3 times. If you only digitize 3 points and have this option selected, it'll only run the digitized ones. Okay, so back to this. We've selected all of our standards. Come down to the bottom, get our unknowns too, acquire, and in this case, we're going to use last unknown sample for our one single routine that's going to run for everything, and we hit run selected samples. And at this point, this dialog comes up, it tells you how long each analysis is, tells you how many hours for standards and unknowns, and the total time for your acquisition. At this point, when you hit yes, PFE is going to drive off and start analyzing your samples. So that's the simple one case scenario where you have one unknown routine that you're going to run on everything. What if you want to run some things one way and some things other? In that case, we can use what are called sample setups. So we'll just go to unknowns to sort of simplify the screen here. And let's say we've got our 4 positions that we've already chosen their locations and got them in good focus, and they're all good, confirmed, and ready to go. But we want to run this one with one routine, and this one with a different routine, and this one with a different, etc., etc. What we can do here is we can select use digitized sample setups. Also, if you hit this sample setup button, which is where you select them, it's going to automatically switch it to that once you hit OK. so it will do it on its own if you forget. So, but you saw here sample setups. We don't have any sample setups, so we have to add those. So if you're not sure how to make sample setups, there are videos already on this channel that show you how to do that, so I'm not going to go into detail to here. But in this case, I have some different setups that I've made to run for different reasons, and I can add those at this point. So I go into Analyze, and I select the one I want. So for instance, this one is chlorine on 3 spectrometers, silica, and sodium. So now what I can do is I can add to sample setups. So when I hit that button, it's going to save it to our sample setups, and it'll be available for us in Automate. So let's go ahead and just add these guys as well. And now when I come over to Automate, I choose my demo 1, and I want to run pass 1. So I can select it and hit OK. And now it's going to use these conditions for demo 1. And for pass 2, I've got aluminum, sulfur, iron, and potassium. So we can come into demo 2, sample setups, I can hit that, say pass 2 is what I want, yes, and I can do that with as many setups as I want. Now when I select all my samples and hit run selected samples, let's uncheck that since we're not going to run any standards in this scenario. I hit run selected samples. Oh, I didn't select one, so it's warning me. It says you didn't pick one for demo 4. So let's go to sample setups. Let's pick pass 2. And now I have sample setup for all of them. I hit run selected samples, same thing. It's going to tell me how long it's going to take and estimate the time. So that's a scenario where you want to run a single setup on a bunch of different samples. What happens if you have one sample that you want to run a bunch of different routines on? In that case, we can use what's called multiple setups. And that's this dialog. Looks the same. It's basically the same, although you do have a few options I'll explain here in a second. So what scenario would you want to do this? Let's say you're doing an analysis where you have some element that you need to run at really high accelerating voltage. Say you got to run at 20 kV for something, but you don't want to torch the rest of your analyses with that high kV because you don't need it. So what you could do is you can have PFE run it at say 10 kV for a bunch of elements, and then it'll switch and run it again at 25 kV. Also, you can use it in the scenario where maybe you have a really long spectrometer travel, where you've got one element at the low end of your spectrometer and another element at the high end of your spectrometer, and you don't really have a choice in how you arrange them. In that case, it might be faster to run all of your samples with one setup wherever all the spectrometers aren't moving very much, and then move the spectrometers to that new position and run them all again, rather than having it move back and forth for every single analysis. So there's quite a few reasons why you might want to use this multiple setups. Maybe you want to run the first 5 elements at one current and the next 5 elements at a different current for beam damage reasons or whatever. So in this case, we're going to do multiple setups. So we select demo 1, and when we hit multiple setups, now we have the option to pick which sample setup. So let's run all 3 of these, and we can hit OK. And it will say, do you want to load those? You say yes, and you see that it also automatically moved to digitize multiple setups. So let's show you again what the options are there, the sort of sub options. So you can have it load the setups in reverse order. So instead of doing pass 1 first, pass 2, pass 3, it will do them pass 3, pass 2, pass 1. This might be important for TDI reasons, whatever reasons you might want to change the order. You can also have it do an increment. Oops, I'm in the wrong one. Multiple setups. You can also have it change to do an increment. So it'll run pass 1, and then it'll do a Y increment, which is the value here, and it will run all of your samples on pass 1, and then it'll go back to your samples. It'll move this increment and run pass 2 and on to pass 3. And then also you can have it run multiple setups one at a time. This is the scenario where, say you have that spectrometer movement, rather than it run setup 1 and then switch to setup 2 and then switch to setup 3 before it moves to the next sample. In this case, it'll run all of your samples on pass 1. It'll go back, run all of your samples at pass 2, go back and run all of your samples at pass 3. So those are the options you have in the multiple setups. So we've selected these all, we've hit OK, and now it's going to run that sample with those multiple setups over and over. So those are the basic functions for running a set of samples in Automate.